Hey, what's up? My name is J.M. Chaley and welcome to my channel. This week I want to talk about more medieval innovations. It's a topic I covered before. In fact, I'm going to reference it up here. But on my last medieval innovations video, I talked about the fantastic, the amazing, the incredible stuff, some of which were conceptual and never really came to fruition. Stuff like a steam engine, a machine gun, a tank. These were medieval concepts that, let's face it, we never really got. But maybe in a high fantasy setting, combined with magic, you could have these types of things. Check out the video if you haven't already. But this video, I wanted to talk about common, yet amazing, innovations that everybody had. This was real life stuff that people had back in the day, during the Middle Ages. Anyone had access to this stuff. It was common, it was normal, but yet it was pretty cool and pretty incredible. I have 5 examples of these type of innovations. I'm saving my favorite 2 for the last. I just happen to think these are really cool. They're simple, but very, very cool. So let's get into it with number 1. Number 1, keeping and storing food. It was always a challenge in medieval times to store food. They didn't have refrigeration. A lot of times things were buried, but medieval folks knew how to preserve food. They actually found ways to dry food and to salt food. They found ways to create preserves. Like when we think of preserves in a jar, they were doing that in medieval times too. Very, very clever, very common, very necessary. They even had a way to preserve meat in what was called potted meats. And what they would do is they'd take a clay pot and put the meat inside. And they would take butter and they would basically melt the butter. They'd boil it up and strain the butter out so that all the bits and basically dairy could be removed from the butter. And all that would be left is the oil. And they basically pour that very high fatty oil into and upon the meat. And that would harden and preserve the meat. And what they would do is take the pot, the whole entire pot, and put it in a hearth, or basically on a grill that would be over a hearth, and heat it up. The oil would boil, cook the meat, bring everything kind of back to life. It would be enriched with all this kind of buttery fat. And the writings from that period rave about how good these potted meats were. Even after a month, the meat would stay good, preserved for a very long time, room temperature, and they could just heat these things up and eat them as if they were fresh. Very innovative, very cool. Number 2, bedding. The beds back in medieval times were pretty innovative. If you were an absolute peasant and you didn't have any money, a lot of people had a stack of hay on the floor. That was the worst case scenario. But for most people who could scrounge together a little bit of money, you sewed something together. You had something. You were able to make a mattress. And usually the mattresses were filled with hay or with rush. Now, rush is a long kind of wispy grass. The most expensive mattresses were filled with feathers. Feather mattresses were very, very common among wealthy people. But in some writings, there was talk of letting servants who were working in the kitchens and plucking ducks and geese and whatnot, they were allowed to keep some of the feathers that they plucked. And they could actually save up enough feathers to make their own feather mattress. And these things were so valuable and so expensive that they actually would pass a mattress down to family members. The other thing they had was rope beds, where they didn't really have some people had multiple mattresses where the heavier mattress would serve as sort of a box spring, but for some people that didn't have that, they built a rope bed, which was just laced rope back and forth across a bed frame and created this kind of hammock-like structure that you could put a mattress over and then lay on top of, and it kind of conformed to your shape as you slept. Yeah, medieval beds were actually very comfortable. Number 3, burning peat. Now, not everyone had access to peat, depending on where you were living during the Middle Ages, but if you lived near a swamp or places where these mossy kind of coverings grew, you could actually cut little turf swaths out, little bricks of peat. And these were basically, literally, little turf bricks that were, mostly covered in moss and whatnot. And they would be dried out, and they were flammable. But they would burn very, very slow. So what would happen is in places where kindling or firewood might be scarce, these were very valuable, because if your fire went out, that's not a good thing. You'd need your fire to go through the night to keep you warm, or you needed the fire next day to cook breakfast. You needed a fire going in the hearth almost 24/7. And using peat bricks was a way to maintain that fire without it extinguishing and burning through too much kindling. So what would happen is you'd get the fire going, you'd cook, you'd do whatever you needed to do over the open flame, and then you'd smolder it. You'd smother the flames with these peat bricks, stack them up on top, and the embers would kind of cool and smolder, but the fire wouldn't really go out. The peat would kind of not really catch fire, but it would start to smolder as well. And you'd still have the remnants of those flames. And then when you need the fire again, you take the bricks off, you use a bellows or whatever, you blow into the flame, whatever it took, bring the fire back to life, and off you go. Very innovative, very cool. This was technology that pretty much everyone had access to if they lived near a place where they could get a hold of these peat bricks. Number 4, rush lights. Rush lights, these things are so cool. Candles were expensive, especially if you consumed a lot of candles. Pretty much in medieval times, you went to bed when it got dark. When the lights were out, there was nothing left to do, you couldn't see, your day was over. So you had to use candles. Now, wax was expensive, beeswax was cheaper. A lot of the common folk had access to beeswax, but beeswax was used for a lot of other things, like preserving food, or, well, the 5th thing I'm about to get to. So they couldn't always use it for everything, especially waste it on a candle that was just going to melt away. So they used rush lights. And what was that? Well, I talked about rushes before. Long, wispy blades of grass, almost like straw. And they would go in and they'd cut, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of these things. Big bales of these things that they could store and keep dry out. So they'd have these long straw-like lengths of these rushes, and they'd roll them and submerge them in fat. So whatever they cooked the previous night, maybe the meat from the stew that they had or what have you, they'd keep the fat. They'd soak the rushes in all the fat and then let it dry again. And guess what? Now they're flammable. And they're like these really thin candles. Now they would burn very, very quickly. They didn't last as long as a candle wick. But remember, you've got hundreds of these things, maybe thousands of them. You'd get a bunch going at the same time. You get a little bit of light, you replace them as you need, and you've got light for hours. Very cheap. This was a very, very common practice, very innovative. Everyone had access to this kind of stuff. Very cool. And finally, number 5, beeswax cloth. This was pretty cool. Another way to preserve food that I wanted to call out in its own example is beeswax cloth. And what they would do is take a piece of cloth, soak it in melted beeswax, pull the cloth out, let it dry. And what you wound up with was a pliable, bendy, sticky cloth. They would wrap their food up in this stuff, and it would help preserve it. This was medieval saran wrap that they had invented. How cool is that? So there you have it, 5 examples of medieval innovations that were common, yet very, very cool. Now, in your own writing, maybe this may have a place in your prose, your description. I mean, granted, if we were writing in the modern times, we wouldn't talk about someone getting out of bed and brushing his teeth and going to the bathroom and getting dressed and driving into work. But in a medieval setting, maybe you talk about, someone getting up in the middle of the night, lighting some rushlights, maybe taking off the peat bricks and lighting the fire, cooking up some stuff. Maybe you take your beeswax cloth and unwrap a piece of cheese that you've been saving, or a piece of bread that you're going to have for a snack, right? And you go back to bed. This is stuff that is very mundane, but your readers might be like, wow, this is pretty, I don't know this experience. I've never lived through this experience. A short little prose about little things like this, these little common innovations, if that's your setting, could add a little bit of immersion or flavor to the world building you have. So yes, that about wraps it up. 5 examples. If you like this video, please give it a like, and as always, please subscribe. I post every Thursday. You can also follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can go to JM Chaley and read the first chapter of my work in progress, A Flower in Hell. While you're there, check out my newsletter. You can sign up for it. You can send me a message. Let's stay in touch. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.